Kristian Lander is a filmmaker, and he's been the producer and host for a number of podcasts, including Our Curious World. He's got an avid interest in the mysteries and unexplained. He's also got a passion for the world of the offbeat and the Fortean. And he has got an insatiable curiosity that's been a driving force for investigating all of this since he was a very young age. He's been a member of ASSAP since 2011. God, that's 13 years now. And Kristian has a regular slot with TNT, Talk News. What is it? Today News Talk Radio on Thursdays.
Yeah, today's News Talk, yeah.
What sort of things do you cover on that, Kristian?
So generally, it's actually on there. It's mainly geopolitics, current affairs. There's a lot of guests, a lot of presenters on there who generally have an alternative view. It's quite interesting mix.
Okay, and you're on in the first hour of the Patrick Henningsen show, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. And you write content for current affairs and geopolitics for 21st Century Wire. When all of that is not taking his time up, he loves to research, produce content and create travel videologues and take pictures of quirky lampposts in a trend he calls lamppost porn. That is actually very good. I've seen that before. You do get some really good pictures on there. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to hand you over for the story of the 800 that never were to Kristian Lander. Good evening, Kristian.
Hey, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction there, Claire. So I hope you can see me okay. I'm just going to go ahead and share this screen. I've been having a bit of a play with this. So I do hope you can see that okay. So that you should be able to see right now the 800 that never were, paranormal misinformation used for dramatic effect.
Yes, we can.
Just as I'm using my voice right now. So, yeah, I've got this all set up now. So I'm going to just talk and ramble away through what this is. So the presentation is entitled The 800 That Never Were, Paranormal Misinformation Used for Dramatic Effect. So for clarity and for modern audiences, the disclaimer is what we talked about a few minutes ago. This talk is going to be considered to be, in many ways, a bit of an expelling of sorts, of a bit of a cloud of negativity that kind of came upon me when I wrote this. So back in what would have been last September, so when I came to learn about this topic, and as for the conversation I've just had with CJ, he's very much more, has a long history with this particular topic, and perhaps once he could join us for a little bit in the Q&A to talk a bit more about this in more detail than I will here. But I wanted to really talk about the different layers of this particular topic, and particularly regards to the new ones that have been added. So it became as a bit of a moment of interest, of fascination, that led to frustration. And once those details were understood, I think you might also be inclined to agree with what I did. So by intention, I wanted to highlight the importance of doing due diligence, the benefits of working from a position and perspective of using factual information, or trying to get as close to source material as possible. Share a powerful story that was of courage in the face of adversity and overwhelming circumstances that goes tragically wrong. So another aspect we're going to cover is, despite being a recorded event that happened more than a century ago, there are records and evidence that show what happened. It finds itself now entering paranormal lore. The buzzword of the moment, of course, is misinformation, so I thought I'd throw that in there as a bit of a layer into that at the top. So one of the chapters discusses a phenomena that was entirely unfamiliar with. So I think, as you and I've watched many of these ASSAP presentations and these webinars, and one of the ones I've seen over the years is when we add topics where there's often an intriguing level of historical events that find themselves into oral folklore. And of these narratives, they can be dramatic, they can be tragic, they become etched in our cultural memory, particularly if they carry a valuable lesson or a forewarning. Thereby, they transform often into paranormal tales. The paranormal story often is what helps the story continue in the lore of a particular location. And one of the examples I wrote down here, of course, was a well that we were told not to drink from. Perhaps the well is contaminated or it is poisoned. So William from 1532 went to a well, he drank, and he died. and now he appears as a kind of spectral apparition to those who attempt to drink from the well. So now Elizabeth's second cousin with the lazy eye and the club foot, she says that she saw him. He was at the well. In a future retelling, it could be that Elizabeth had the club foot because she drank from the well. And what happens is the stories often change. These kind of these elements that people latch in on become the anchor points of the story, while potentially elements of the core story do remain. Hopefully that no one continue to drink from the well, regardless of the paranormal stories that are now adding to the folklore as to why would you? So these potentially are not necessarily deliberate alterations of the story, but they are storytelling adaptations that continue to weave culturally, ebbing and flowing with each iteration and evolving with the intention of the storyteller and the understanding of the listener. And that continues on. Every exercise, as you know, with Chinese whispers, with friends and colleagues, can always provide examples of changing stories from one end of the line to another. In this case, the root story, as mentioned there, is drinking from the contaminated well. It's etched in social tapestry that's a familiar trope that I believe we can all kind of instantly visualize. We all kind of get this, where we're coming from with this. And there is a kind of, I believe the people listening here tonight and those watching on YouTube or BitChute or anywhere in the future, we will perhaps understand the communication dynamics and how they occur. So what about that layer that has now been deliberately added? And it's something I want to come to very shortly. So in true Cosmos fashion, let's take a trip on the time ship of imagination. Let's take ourselves back in time more than 100 years to the years of the Great War, the war to end wars, the war known as World War I, where many nations were drawn into conflict. The British always like to be at the heart of such things, poking the bears and stoking the fires and directing affairs linked to the expanse and the continuation of the empire. Our journey takes us near the city, what we call in modern English, Gallipoli or Kallopolis, the Greek for beautiful city, which I'm sure I've already butchered in that pronunciation, but it lends itself the name to this particular peninsula. Part of the Dardanelles campaign to control the area that needed swift and concise control to maintain fuel and transportation routes. A band of brothers, occasionally misidentified as the Sandringham regiment. And I think, as I say that, more people will go, I'm familiar with this story. I can see many of you nodding there and perhaps recognizing where our story and our journey tonight is going to go. Yes, the Sandringham regiment. Its members were drawn from conscripts from northern Norfolk and beyond. This insight comes to me from historian and author Steve Smith, who's the contributor to Historic UK. These forming companies hailed from towns and villages as far north as Great Yarmouth, as far south as Sandringham. So these young men, these boys, were in their hundreds. They were sent to the brutal front lines of the Ottoman Empire, the region of North and West Turkey. It's worth highlighting here that what was once known as E Company, the Sandringham Company, ceased to exist on the 5th of February 1915, when they were reformed into a 4-company battalion, with the E and C Company merging together, forming the company called the King's Company. So 5 companies became 4. So disappearances, mysterious clouds, and of course, aliens. The events of the Battalion Norfolk Regiment on the 12th of August 1915 at Kunach Anafatar over. Again, I'm butchering these terrible pronunciations. But based on the interpretation, misunderstandings, deliberate play on communications down the years, has led us to a point where we need to understand a 3-dimensional understanding of where this is. Weird. Holding fast to documented information and to sort where the supernatural elements have now come and forged into the events. We have a dispatch by Ian Hamilton reporting that the colonel's 16 officers, 250 men, kept pushing on and driving the enemy before them. And not one of them was seen, not saw or heard of. They charged into the forest and were lost to sight and sound, and not one came back. The second point is that on the 50th anniversary of Gallopoli, when it rolled around in 1965, references to the Sandringham Company, battalion and regiment first started to emerge, and when 3 New Zealand veterans claimed that they saw a British regiment marching up a sunken road, then was swallowed up by a rising cloud. As you can imagine, this has also now led to other theories that have now been doing the rounds. I've heard and I've read accounts now that perhaps there was aliens there, that there was angels there, that there was a landing of flying saucers and they carried soldiers off into the unknown. There was, in 1989, a book and a TV adaptation that were highly charged at the time, and about the solution to what happened to this missing company of individuals. So here we have an interesting book. So September 2023 saw the release of this new book here. It was penned by Ken Gossord and Barbara DeLong. So before Roswell. So as a secret history of UFOs, I've got a book synopsis here, and I'll read it because it makes sense and it's contextual to the situation. The famous Roswell incident is, in many perspectives, the origin of what we've come to know of the UFO phenomenon, and in recent times, a UAP threat. Roswell is indeed the major turning point in terms of public awareness, as well as government involvement, at least in the United States. But it didn't start at Roswell. The public view of UFOs began long before 1947. That was merely a continuation of long-standing phenomenological patterns. An abundance of UFO in historical context exists long before Roswell. And looking back through the centuries into antiquity and beyond, citing 364 cases. Can you guess which one of those cases is also going to reference this particular presentation we're going to be talking about tonight? So DeLonghi and Gossord show that anomalous phenomena is as enduring through the ages through witnessed and reported cases. Now, perhaps the editor should have reworded that because I did read that verbatim. So, on the 22nd of September, I'm flicking through my podcast subscription updates on my phone on my way to work. And amongst them, I've listened to Creepy Cove, I've listened to the No Sleep podcast, and Best of Coast to Coast AM, which is kind of a 10 to 15-minute clip of their most recent episode. And Barbara DeLonghi happens to be the guest, along with George Norrie, that particular day. So I'm flicking through and I'm wondering what to listen to on my way to work. What's this about? Okay, this is an interesting topic. So as you can see here, this is what I read on that particular day. So, and I took a screenshot to make sure it is as it was on that particular day. So Barbara DeLonghi is the guest announcing this book. George Norrie and Barbara DeLong discussed the history of UFOs before the famous Roswell case, including the Battle of Los Angeles, a German pilot, the Red Baron, shooting down a UFO, and as it states here, 800 British soldiers who entered a portal never to be seen again. So I've decided I've got to hit the play button. I've got no idea what this is about, because I hadn't made the link between this case and, of course, the one we're talking about. So let's move on and hit play and listen to how this was presented. Hopefully the audio will go out to you guys as well. Pressing play now.
In 1915, a case I had never heard about before until I saw your book. In Turkey, a regiment of British Army members, 800 men, simply disappeared. Where did they go?
Well, now there was a fog. There was a strange fog, and they were attempting to take a hill at Suvia Bay near Gallipoli. There were 22 witnesses. The regiment of over 800 men marched into a strange fog of clouds hovering over the hill, and they were never seen again. And, you know, the British thought that they had been taken prisoner, and the Turks just denied any knowledge of the existence at all. And no sign of the regiment has ever been found. 800 men. I mean,
I know, we're not talking about a handful of guys that disappear. 800, my God.
I want to know who the 22 were that didn't go.
The smart ones.
Yeah, obviously.
I hope you managed to hear that clearly. So as I said, this was the first time I'd ever heard of this particular case. So Barbara says the foundation of her work, when I listen back to this, is actually from her husband, Patrick Cook, who is a long-term author and researcher of the paranormal. So let's just review some of those bullet points that she said in that. There was 800 British soldiers. They marched up a hill. They entered a mysterious cloud and never to be seen again. That is a hit on the scale of potentially weird and invoking paranormal fervor that encouraged me to continue listening. I'll play now the second clip. This is when George asked her about her thoughts on the case and what she thought had happened.
What's your best guess on that one, Barbara? What a story.
I think the fog opened a portal to another dimension, and they marched into another dimension.
Now, that's interesting. Like they walked through a portal or something?
Yeah, I think it was a portal.
And they could never find their way back?
Well, I think they walked into another dimension that had a physical reality similar to ours. They probably were... I think they went into a dimension that was very similar to the Earth plane right now, almost like on another timeline, almost. And I think that's what happened. I don't think they were taken into a ship and whisked off someplace. I think they became interdimensional.
The late Jim Mars talks about the 1897 Aurora, Texas UFO crash. That was a fascinating one.
Okay, sure it was. Yeah. So her view is that, of course, a portal opened, and these individuals went into another dimension that mirrored the Earth one. So again, this is me before I knew any details of this particular case. So right now, my kind of spooky senses are kind of going wild, going, this is a really interesting case. I'd like to know more. And so I just turned my detail, like many of us do, to the internet. So endeavoring to find out more, it was one internet search later. I found author and historian Steve Smith, who gives an excellent, concise essay on the Historic UK website, a very sensible historical record, although according to CJ, there's a few things that he might have got wrong. So Steve, who I did invite here tonight, hopefully he can shed some truths on the matter at hand. And I want to cross-reference some of the details of the particular event and how we've got to this particular time with these kind of fantastical stories happening. So where are we going to start here? So working with some of his details, as well as some of the in-depth piece wrote by a guy called Trevor Grove, who wrote an interesting article called UFOs and the Royal Battalion That Just Vanished, that appeared on the AOL message boards in 1999. It was published on the night of All the King's Men that aired on BBC One, starring Davy Jayton. That's been kept alive online by the mailarchive.com. And there was also another book called The Vanished Battalion, written by one of the makers of that television show called Nigel McCreary. So I will draw from each of those sources to lay out a series of events for you to understand what those soldiers went into, some depth and some context, and to kind of give you a proper three-dimensional view of how this situation occurred. So again, I'll read a few excerpts in the book here that are relevant. So that hot August in 1914, it was a popular war. Lord Kitchener's target of raising 100,000 volunteers was soon overtaken as groups of men, friends, teammates, and work colleagues scrambled to enlist in the war. What was the amateur soldiers of E Company had in common with the rather uncommon folks, something that was to later altogether make their unexplained fate a year later in the chaotic slaughter of Gallipoli. Many did work on the Sandringham royal estate at the personal instigation of their employer, King Edward VII. He asked Frank Beck, who David Jason portrayed in that BBC production, because he was the land agent and he managed the estate, but he was a captain of the volunteer battalion of the Norfolks to undertake the task, and he did so enthusiastically and raised more than 100 Saturday night soldiers. As was the pattern of the territorial battalions of the day, the military rank in B Company was also based on social caste. What this means is that members of the gentry, like Frank Beck and his two nephews,
I know, Rona. I do. I have chicken for you.
Okay, well, that chicken sounds lovely, my dear. I'll ask you to mute if that's okay, and I'll come over for chicken soup another day. Thank you very much. So it says here the estate foremen, the butlers, the gamekeepers, the head gardeners, they made up the commanding officers. So the farm labourers, the grooms, the household servants made up a rank and file. So it was interesting. So basically the way that your workplace worked was the way that you were sent to war. Effectively, you better make sure you're friends with your boss, otherwise, you might be sent out to the front line earlier than necessary. So the Royal Association, of course, gave these Sandringham regiment, the E Company, a bit more of a reputation and a public awareness. Understandably, family members, members of nobility, were actually invested in them. And it was during the disastrous Dardanelles campaign, in the middle of the very first battle on the August the 12th, 1915, that nearly all of them disappeared, literally in a puff of smoke. 1 minute, the men were there, led by the battalion's commanding officer, Horace Proctor Beauchamp, charging bravely against the Turkish enemy, and then they were not. There were no survivors at the time. They did not turn up as prisoners of war. They simply vanished. Now, returning to Steve's account, we know that a number of the Norfolks managed to advance 1,400 yards to a sunken road, moving uphill before stopping and awaiting the rest of the battalion. Second Lord Fawkes commanded this small group, and he was ordered to press on by Colonel Belchamp. Virtually all of them were taken down as they bunched up in a gap covered by a machine gun. They were encircled by Turkish treetop snipers who targeted them easily because of the sunlight reflecting off their bayonets. A small element of the Norfolks managed to reach a vineyard. Another element managed to reach a group of cottages, where they were joined by Colonel Belchamp and the adjutant. Belchamp was last seen by a person called Private Smith. He says, "Hound them out, boys," and it was the last time he was seen, probably the last order he gave. It was here that the surviving officers managed to take stock of what they had and of what had happened, and Major Barton and Lieutenant Evelyn Beck led the survivors of these friendly lines back under cover of darkness. No word got out after. It's worthy to understand the conditions that these soldiers were faced with. The battalion had landed in Sulver Bay on August the 10th, 2 days amid bursting shells, the sound of machine gun fire, and immediately ordered inland. The official history of the Norfolk Regiment quotes that a senior officer describing the terrain that confronted the young troops straight off the ship from Britain as they toiled up these beaches on their heavy packs. Before them lay a sandy plain covered with scrub, a dry salt lake showing dazzling white in the hot sun morning. Beyond was a number of stunted oaks, gradually becoming more dense further inland, providing excellent cover for enemy snipers, a mode of warfare of which the Turks were very adept. The regiment's history goes on that officers and men were continuously being shot down, not only by rifle fire from advanced posts, but by men and women even firing behind our own firing lines. A particular kind of tree in this part of the world lends itself well to concealment. Being short with dense foliage, here the sniper would lurk with their faces painted green as to defy detection. When discovered, these snipers had in their possession more than enough food and water for a considerable period of time and more than an ample supply of ammunition. And besides the Turkish snipers, some of whom were British, the newly arrived British soldiery were warned, disguised themselves as pigs to get close to the animals and got close behind enemy lines. The climate was also broiling by day, freezing by night. Swarms of flies were setting upon their food as they were putting them in their mouths. These men were also suffering from dysentery from the side effects of inoculations, seasick tablets that were administered on the voyage. Above all, there was also a lack of water. 2 pints of water were supposed to last each man 3 days. The far cry from the shady lanes and lush pastures of England's peaceful acres. Then on the 12th of August, they arrived in this arid, hostile land. The 5th Battalion was told to attack that afternoon. The orders were confused. Some thought they were meant to clear a way forward into the enemy positions and root out snipers in preparation for the British assault the following day. Others believed that they were on their way to the village of Anafartasaga on the ridge ahead of them. No one knew of the position of the brigade headquarters, where the field dressing stations were, where the battalion's machine guns were supposed to be. The officers were also handed maps, which soon as they discovered, they did not even show the location on the maps of where they were supposed to be attacking. The men had been out in the sun all day. They were thirsty, they were scared, they were inexperienced, and now they were supposed to launch a major assault against a well-armed foe in broad daylight and scant cover on a track road. The whole enterprise simply was a shambles. But at 4:15, the whistles blew, and the Norfolks began their advance, led by Colonel Belchamp, smoking, waving his cane above his head. "Come on, the Norfolks, we shall go forward." Apart from him, all the officers were armed with rifles instead of revolvers, and so the Turkish snipers couldn't distinguish them from their men and kill them first. But someone gave the order to fix the bayonets and advance on the double, and they were then forced up a 1.5 mile march to the Turkish positions, and the carnage began immediately. These Turkish artillery were able to track them via the sun glinting on their bayonets. By the time the Norfolks had reached the enemy lines, they were exhausted. Or worse still, the speed of the advance had put them some way ahead of the rest of the brigade, so much so that the Turks were able to surround them from the rear and cut off a retreat. A desperate battle ensued, and officers and men were cut down around from the snipers hidden in the trees. Everywhere, officers and men were falling. Amidst the bloodshed, Colonel Belchamp continued to advance into a woodland towards the Turks' main positions, leading a band of 16 officers and 250 men. Amongst them were the Sandringhams. Eventually, the colonel was spotted standing with another officer in a farm at the side of the wood. "Now, boys, we've got the village. Let's hold it." Then the wood began to burn, and that was the last anyone saw or heard of Balcham, the smoke coming from the trees covering them. In 1918, the war had ended, and under the terms of the armistice, the War Graves Commission allowed the Gallipoli battlefields to be checked for unidentified graves to return their servicemen. And of them, there was, of the 36,000 men who died in that campaign, 13,000 rest in unidentified graves and 14,000 were never found. Now, Ian Hamilton was our British commander-in-chief in Gallipoli at the time. He was as puzzled as everyone else. And in a dispatch to Kitchener, he reported that in the course of the fight that happened a very mysterious thing, quoted. During the attack, he explained that the Norfolks had found themselves some way ahead of the British line, where the fighting grew hotter and the ground was more wooded and broken. And Balchamp, along with those 250 men and 16 officers, still kept pushing on, driving the enemy before them. Amongst them, there were ardent souls who were a fine company, listed from the Sandringham estates, but nothing more was seen or heard from them. Disappeared. They charged into the forest, and were lost to sight and sound, and not one ever came back. It's interesting. I found that Queen Alexandria, she inquired to the American ambassador in Constantinople if the Turks had taken them as prisoner, and there was a report that they had not. The local papers of the time reported the loss of the 5th Norfolk officers. There's an article I found the 27th of August from the Yarmouth Mercury. It is said that with deepest regret, we published the list of the missing soldiers of 5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment. At the time of going to press, of course, they had not found any, and they were just missing. And Hamilton's dispatch did not appear publicly until the 6th of January in 1916, and then was reported publicly on the 7th of January 1916, where the title says, "The Sandringham men disappear." The article went on to state that 16 officers, 250 men had pushed into deep lines, they were lost to sight and sound, and none ever came back. Now, from Steve's historic UK account, he writes down that a number of the Norfolks managed to advance that 1,400 yards up a sunken road before stopping and waiting the rest of the battalion. Lieutenant Folks, he commanded the small group, and he was ordered to press on further by Colonel Balchamp. Unfortunately, a fate then awaited them under the death, really, of enemy machine gun fire. And then eventually there was a small party of people managed to get back under back to friendly lines at the time. I realised that has actually not moved forward on the screenshots. I do apologise for that. But on February the 15th, the Lynn News reported that one officer was now recovering in Constantinople. And this is Captain Coxon, which came as a relief to not only his friends, but also to those who were awaiting news of the other officers and the 5th Norfolks. It is obvious that an officer in hospital would have had greater opportunity to write home to his friends than others who were not wounded, who were prisoners of war. In a report from the proactive Lynn News, Private Sidney Pooley, a survivor of the conflict, wrote an account, and I'm just going to grab a quick snippet of that. We have found the 5th Norfolks. There were 180 in all, 122 Norfolk, a few Hants, a few Suffolks, and the 2/4 Cheshires. We could identify Privates Barnaby and Carter. They were scattered over an area of 1 mile at a distance of 800 yards behind the Turkish front line. Many of them had evidently been killed on a farm, as the local Turk who owns the place told us when he came back home he found his farm covered in decomposing bodies of British soldiers, which he had then thrown into a small ravine. The whole thing bears out the original theory that they did not get very far on. They were mopped up one by one, all except the ones who got to the farm. Now, McCrae covered in his book The Vanished Battalion and the account of Gordon Parker, who was a successful businessman who had been a Royal Engineers signaller in Gallipoli, of a conversation that he and his friend, Reverend Pierpoint Edwards, had some years after the war. According to Parker, Edwards revealed an extraordinary tale that he had withheld from his official report about the fate of the 5th Norfolks, namely that every one of the bodies had been shot in the head. The enemy, the Turks, the Ottomans, took no prisoners, and an account from Arthur Webber, a boy survivor of the battle that fateful day. there is actually a casualty list recorded between the 12th and 31st of August in 1915. But there was 11 officers and 151 other ranks killed, and that comes from the database of the soldiers who died in the Great War. So, I didn't really want to end this webinar as such, feeling down from a tragedy on that day. What I wanted to do was to work backwards, flipping the script now, because we now already know the conclusion. We know the factual ending to that regiment, who they were, where their bodies were found, about 4 years later, identified as the Norfolks by their shoulder badges, at least 122 of them, of the 180 bodies that Edwards found in the ravine. So let's re-examine some of those bullet points we talked about earlier and from the sound clip we played, the paranormal bullet points, and let's look at those anomaly conclusions, how they were founded, how we got there. Let's see if we can find any more weirdness, because there is some. So let's listen back to Barbara DeLonghi's comments to George Norrie on Coast to Coast. She said that 800 British soldiers, they march up a hill, entered a mysterious cloud, never to be seen or found again. Quite how 250 men disappear, have expanded to 800 is certainly odd. A wider contingent of the landing barracks position may have had a larger forward station there, who may have faced similar events and numbers conflated together. The number 800, if you recall, did appear in the chaplain Reverend Pierpoint's Edwards account, that the soldiers were 800 yards behind enemy lines. So is this a layer of misinformation that has now been added to the story? Range of public interviews, Barbara may have been acting off incorrect details gathered by her husband or added herself. There are at least crux points that must be a challenge to say that's going to muddy the waters, obfuscating and adding more information. But I don't believe it was. I don't believe it was deliberate. I just think it's a lack of due diligence that these matters weren't addressed earlier. To say, wait a minute, where am I getting this information from? Shouldn't I have checked this? This book's going to publication. I'm then going to go on a press tour. Wait a minute, have I not just checked it? It took me one internet search. I've looked at top search on Google, and I found all these answers here. I found Steve's website. I looked at this account. I saw the BBC account. I honestly, personally thought when I listened to that on September the 21st last year, I'd come across a case that was really interesting, had such fantastical elements, and within a matter of 2 minutes, I found the answer and read these articles, and I went, oh, wait a minute. This person simply didn't do any due diligence publishing this. And I honestly felt quite, being in the paranormal community who produces content, we exist in a section of people who want to spread good news and good information. I honestly felt so frustrated. And I said to Claire, I've got a presentation that I want to get out there. Back in September last year, I know I was quite annoyed about it. I really felt that frustration upon me because I thought that someone, perhaps within not necessarily our community, but in the wider paranormal community, was putting information that wasn't being checked. There was no checks and balances to the data being published out there. I reached out to Barbara. I didn't get any reply. I don't think I was expecting any. But I wanted to end that kind of childish rant here now. To say, I've moved on from that emotion. And there is some further oddities to this account. So marching up the hill into a mysterious cloud, how did that come about? So this is where we venture into the anomalist account. So in April 1965, it was the 50th anniversary commemorations to mark the Allies' Gallipoli landings. And a former New Zealand sapper called Frederick Rickard issued a testimony supported by 3 other veterans. Rickard claimed that he had seen supernatural disappearance of the 5th Norfolks from the August 1915. And in the afternoon in question, according to Rickard, he and his comrades had seen a formation of 6 to 8 loaf-shaped clouds hovering in the area where the Norfolks had pressed home their attack. Another similar-shaped, solid-looking cloud was resting on the ground. In this cloud, said Rickard, marched the battalion. An hour or so later, the cloud, very unobtrusively, rose and joined the clouds overhead, whereupon they sailed off into the north, leaving no trace of the soldiers behind them. And that story first appeared in a New Zealand publication called Spaceview, which I'm sure you can see up there on the screen at the present time. And so it then became taken up by UFO magazine called Flying Saucers. So despite its unreliable provenance and inconsistencies, Rickard cited the wrong date, the wrong battalion, and incorrect location, but it has kind of gained a kind of retrospective authority in the public imagination. Never to be seen or heard from again, We saw that repeatedly, and we've learned in material. We know where them individuals were found. Ian Hamilton, the British Commander-in-Chief, of course, he was as puzzled as everyone else. He reported to Kitchener in the UK. There happened a many mysterious thing. So it may seem to the casual paranormal eye that Ian Hamilton may have been referring to these clouds. He wasn't. It was during the attack. The Norfolks had somewhat pulled ahead of the British line. That was his reference point. It's possible that these clouds saw in one account that they were being saved by angels within them, aliens or paranormal means. And it must have indeed done the rounds, bereaved families back in 1915, potentially, that it brought them some comfort to know there was a legend of an appearance of an angel like that of the troops at Mons, that their loved ones, instead of enduring the horrors of the Belgian trenches or here in Gallipoli, they instead had a miraculous saving. McCreary generously ascribed Rickard's story to one of genuine confusion from the smoke from the woodland, maybe a perspective of low-hanging clouds rather than a false narrative or fabrication. So that is my story, really, of our presentation this evening. Thank you for sharing this time here today. You can find me at kristianlander.com. I follow all kinds of strange, weird, and wonderful 14 things. At the ASSAP YouTube channel and our BitChute channel and a Rumble channel as well. Our videos are quite popular. It'd be good if you could subscribe if you haven't already. But here are the sources that I used today for this presentation. And I thank you very much for your time and appreciation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristian. That was really, really good. As we expected, it is a fascinating talk, very emotive. A lot of people here would have been directly involved in the armed forces or know people that were. So aside from all of our collective passion in the paranormal and the unexplained, and then there was that extra addition to it. So thank you very much on behalf of me. And I think we had over about 54, 55 people at one point. So that was,
again,
there's
55 now, so yeah.
Yeah, excellent attendance. I'm just looking to see if anyone else would like to jump. If you want to jump in with any questions.
Can you hear me, Claire?
Oh, hello. Hi, CJ.
Yeah, can I have a quick word? Because that was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Kristian. I'm at my girlfriend's at the moment, so I don't know if you can hear me okay.
I can, yes. I can hear you just fine.
Yeah, no, that was brilliant. There were a few things about it. Let's start by dispelling a myth. Firstly, they weren't conscripts. The really weird thing was, I'll start with that. You mentioned the word conscript, but they weren't. They were volunteers. And it's actually a really interesting bit of our history in this respect, because the war, as you said, was a massively popular one. Everybody thought it would be over by Christmas in 1914, but in 1915, there's still a wave of jingoism and patriotism, and people are signing up. And Kitchener creates his new army, and this is actually, they weren't meant to be used for a long time after this, but this is the beginning of the first actions involving the new troops. Now, in fact, some of these units had existed before. Around about 1906 to 1908, I believe. But if Steve Smith's around, he'll know, because he really is the expert on that. They reorganised the yeomanry regiments and the local militia regiments to county militia, and they created new territorial battalions. And most British regiments have always had for at least 3 battalions, one of which was normally a reservist and stayed at home, and the other 2 would be out with a brigade somewhere. But on this occasion, they went up to 5 battalions of the Norfolks, and the same with the Suffolks. My great uncle had joined in my grandmother's brother had joined in 1910, and he'd served for a few years, but he never expected to go to war, because the whole point about being in the 5th was that they were a territorial regiment that was designed to only work within England or within Wales or within Scotland, within your home territory, for the purpose of defending it. They were more like a dad's army unit. So when these Saturday soldiers, as you so aptly called them, were given the opportunity in 1915 to go to war by Kitchener, people were quite shocked when most of them volunteered. The vast majority chose to go. And when that happened, it was very hard for anyone to refuse. Now, Frank Beck, actually, another thing is that Frank Beck was the king's steward at Sandringham, and the king begged him not to go. The king thought Beck was too old. Beck I think he was only in his 40s, but he didn't want Beck to go along. And despite that, and despite the fact he was a personal favourite of the King and Queen Alexandra of Denmark, he chose to actually to stay, and that's why the Queen was so sorry to go, and that was why the Queen was so sad at his loss. When they got there, and this is the bigger picture, and I'm sorry if I'm ranting, but this is one of my passions, gathered. They discovered something else which is quite odd, which is Stockford, who was the commander-in-chief, who had been sent by Churchill to Gallipoli to open a new front, had done so back in April. They'd started a new front to try and break the impasse in the Western Front and to take Turkey out of the war. And the idea was they were going to march to Constantinople, Istanbul. It's Constantinople now. Anyway, they were going to march to Istanbul and take Turkey out of the war. But what actually happened was that the heroic Anzac troops, Australian and New Zealand troops, had landed, and the British had landed further down at Helles Bay, were completely pinned down and able to get nowhere. In 1901, Turkey had been described as the sick man of Europe, and the Turkish were believed to be cowardly, morally weak, pathetic troops who would break at the first sight of war. And the truth was completely the opposite. They were brilliant soldiers, and that is often not emphasized enough. The Turkish resistance was fantastic. Now, when the British arrived with their third invasion force on August the 6th, 1915, they have got 20,000 men who go ashore at Suvla Bay. 20,000 soldiers were shipped ashore over 2 days. And at that time, there were 1,200 Turks there to defend. There were 3 battalions. That night, one of those battalions was pulled away to the south to try and stop the Anzac breakout from the Anzac lines. So in fact, there's only about 800 people. And for the next 2 days, quite famously, Stockford failed to leave his ship. He actually stayed on the Jonquil, the battleship, and commanded from there while he sent thousands of men ashore. But there was no plan, no orders. The Turks didn't have any lines at that point. There were no trenches, not much defences. What they had were some troops scattered on 3 separate hills, including Hill 60, the famous Hill 60. And to the south, you've got Battleship Hill, which I'll mention again in a minute, and Rhododendron Spur, and where the Anzacs are fighting. But the actual terrain could have been taken at any point on that first day. By August the 8th, Mustafa Kemal, who later becomes known as Ataturk, is sent with 2 divisions of Turks across to try and defend the gap. And by that point, I think the Turks are up to about 5,000 men, but they're still outnumbered 4-1. So they don't stand a chance if the British attack properly and attack promptly. 4 days later, the Aquitania, a luxury liner, has disembarked the Norfolks, with the exception of 230 men who were left behind, and 15 officers, presumably because they were sick. But actually, when I looked it up, the reason was they didn't have enough capacity to ferry them to the landing point. And when they arrived, they found a scene of absolute chaos. There was no organised camps. The piers were still being built. The Royal Engineers didn't know what was happening. Henry Moseley, the brilliant British chemist who had discovered the atomic number, and who many scientists claim would have definitely won a Nobel Prize, it's actually been argued by some that the death of Moseley was the single worst outcome of World War I. He was shot dead while trying to get the piers put together by a Turkish sniper. So when they attack, it's against a legendary incompetence. And the only reason Stockford was considered fit to command was because that he had seniority. He was a better he was an older commander than anybody else. You know, he was higher up in the ranks. He had more years of service. So they had no one else. Stockford massacred those men. He really did. So 4 days later, on the 10th, the Norfolks land, and they spend 2 days failing to advance while no one knows what's going on, before they're ordered with the Hampshires and the Cheshires and the Suffolks and a few others I think were there to actually go forward. But no one gave them any clear orders. And this is where Steve Smith is brilliant, because the complete lack of any orders is what led to the complete failure. And after they set off, the Norfolks were led by Beauchamp Proctor or Proctor Beauchamp. I can always get his name the wrong way around. But as they're advancing, he's an ex-cavalry officer. And he's used to the kind of pre-1914 strategy of break through the lines, sortie behind the lines. So he just leads his men. His orders are to advance. He doesn't bother about the fact they haven't got a target, they haven't got an objective. If they'd marched up the hill, they might have survived, but they didn't march up the hills where Camel had got the guns, the artillery. They pushed up towards Anafarta, towards the village, and then they went straight through. They kept moving forwards, looking for the Turkish trenches, and what they didn't realise was there weren't any Turkish trenches because there wasn't any Turkish defensive line. They had already pushed past the Turks. So they just kept going. And the Turks, as a result, were able to surround them and kill them. That's basically what happened. And at that point, I should shut up. But one more thing. In 1976, this was all utterly debunked by a guy called Melvin Harris. And he wrote 2 paperback books in which he looked at the famous New Zealanders' accounts. Now, assuming they were attached to their regiments and weren't for some reason attached to the British landing to the north, they would have been looking from Battleship Hill. It's entirely possible, because I've seen photos of the terrain, that from Battleship Hill and down there near the rhododendron spur, they could have seen the advance. But I think they would have seen it as a tiny dot in the distance. They were 6 to 8 miles further south, if I remember rightly. If they did see the advance and they saw smoke, one thing we do know is that the Turkish guns set fire to the brush, and Hamilton himself, he wasn't commander-in-chief, he was the British chief of staff, and he was surrounded by incompetent generals. On the day after all this happened, he cabled Winston Churchill, who immediately ordered all of the generals sacked, apart from the Irish general Mahon, and Mahon resigned rather than be forced to serve under some new guy he didn't like. He resigned on the spot and left his division being shot to pieces at Sulphur Bay and went home. Yeah, brilliant. Later became a senator, but there you go. But generally speaking, the levels of incompetence are utterly legendary, and what was happening there was barking. The 1976 debunking by Melvin Harris in his 78 book as well covers it, and it's published again in paperback in the 80s. And in 1981 to 83, there's a part work called The Unexplained by Peter Brooksmith. Do you remember it, the magazine that used to come out?
I can't say I do, it's not something I read.
It's brilliant. It's in 13 volumes. It was a weekly magazine that came out throughout the 80s. And Brooksmith has, I think it's Frank Smythe does the article, but there's an article in which they talk about the story of them going into the cloud, and it completely debunks it. And it gives the details of where the bodies were found, and it's one of the best articles on the topic. So, but that's 1983, and I read it as a 14-year-old boy. Now, my interest in it was that my grandmother knew some of the regiments because, as I said, her brother was in the Suffolks. What actually happened that day was they got to point 28 on the map, which is a designation they used squares on the official maps. They left their maps behind, most of the soldiers, because, as you said, there were no clear targets marked on it. And as they advanced, they got to point 28 when the commander-in-chief suddenly sends forward a message. Stockford sends forward a message saying that Company C, which is the machine gun support company, must remain behind. He's decided to form a defensive line. And what actually happens after that is Beaumont gets really angry and demands that they go forwards. And the poor guy, the commander, was it Colm Seymour, something like that? He goes forwards, backwards and forwards, and in the end, he just sort of stays in the middle between the two of them, not sure what to do until he collapses from heat stroke. The fact he collapsed from heat stroke tells you what the day was like. But at that point, they're ordered, the 5th Norfolks are ordered to move half left and proceed. So they set off at an angle. They've got a better line of advance, and they've got Beaumont shouting at them. He was despised by his men because he was a bit of a tyrant. And as a cavalry officer, as I said, he doesn't wait for the Hampshires or the others. So there's a continually opening gap which allows the Turks to flank them in circles and eventually cut them to pieces. So the whole story is just miserable. And there was no doubt if you read the Lynn News from 1915 or the East Anglian newspapers, or you read the War Office reports, Hamilton reports seeing them disappearing into a forest. There isn't actually a forest, only scrub. But it was burning so intently that some of the British officers reported seeing wounded men consumed by the flames and dying trying to crawl away from the fires. So that's the kind of hellhole. And of course, it gets better because November, December, having held the area and dug 2 trench lines opposite each other, they sat and faced one another. Thousands die. And then I think it's 1,200 people die on one night of freezing to death, frostbite cases of dysentery in November, at which point they decide, sod this, and they withdraw everybody. And the only successful bit of Gallipoli was the brilliant withdrawal. So, you know, the British soldiers were immensely brave. So were the Turkish soldiers in this case. Both sides were lions led by donkeys. Our side was lions led by donkeys. And the other side was led by Mustafa Kemal, who was a brilliant commander and the best the Ottomans had. So it's a horrific tragedy, but it's been debunked so many times. And to hear it still being repeated, it's just so depressing, isn't it? It makes me angry every time.
It is, because there's a want to make it a kind of supernatural savior event. But it really isn't. It was a terrible, military decision that went terribly, horribly wrong. And it's kind of entered this paranormal folklore now, due to that account in 1965 by those New Zealand individuals. And yeah, sure, different.
There's a couple of things. As has been mentioned, essentially the strategy from the British point of view was to attack Turkey after Turkey went into the war. Turkey tried to negotiate the best possible deal and decided that they would side actually with the Germans and the Austrians. The Turkish army was not in a particularly good state, but they were very good fighters, as has been said, and the point is this, that the Austrians advised the Turks. So what they did was they actually set, to a certain extent, the same pattern that was occurring on the Western Front, on the Eastern Front, which meant trenches semi-concealed, and in front of those trenches a large killing ground. Behind the trenches there were field guns and mortars to enhance the killing effect over which the British troops would have to pass. Then behind those lines, in between the mortar stations to a certain extent and the larger field guns, there would be attack battalions to meet the enemy in the field if they actually managed to take and hold some of the trenches, their first trench line. Therefore, what's happened here, just to explain it, is in certain parts the British managed to actually take those trenches and push on behind those trenches, only to be engaged by Turkish troops who were held in reserve precisely to basically deal with that. And therefore you get what effectively were sort of, I don't know what the best way of describing this, ambushes, which occurred. And this may have occurred in this particular instance, though of course the story is confusing.
Yeah, I can see.
That's what happened at Helles Bay, and that's what happened at the Anzac. Yeah, they have in-depth defences. They hadn't actually managed to create any at all at Suvla Bay by August the 12th. There were no. They were expecting. The British were expecting to encounter Turkish trenches, but there weren't any for the simple reason the Turks hadn't had time to dig any.
Yes.
Because they had not expected there to be an attack there. So that was why they pushed on, because there was nothing there to stop them. And when they pushed on, because they didn't find the enemy, that was why they eventually just found themselves surrounded, as you say, and ambushed and destroyed. But it was the lack of a target, and it was the lack of any kind of clear front line that led to the whole disaster, as I understand it.
That's right. What I'm trying to get at here, CJ, is the troops Turkish troops that were held in reserve for the possibility of the breaching of the trench line further away could easily be manoeuvred into position in order to ambush.
Okay, I see what you're saying. There. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's during the attack. There is the Anzacs actually carry out a spectacularly horrific, heroic charge. The Australian light horse charge along what's called the neck, which is NEK, a small, narrow band of land where they are machine gunned down, and 3 waves went forwards. And it's always blamed on the British by the Australians, but actually it was an Australian officer who was ordering it. One of the officers was desperate to stop the waves going, and he went forwards, but he couldn't find the commander-in-chief, and it was because he'd led the first attack and died in the first 30 seconds. So by the time he got permission to countermand the attack, the wave who heard, the Australians looked at one another, shrugged, and went over the top, charging it, cheering anyway, and they died. It was an incredible heroism by the Australian light horse who were on foot, and it was during this same period of the war, the same day, I believe. But that kind of sacrifice just led to nothing apart from endless death. Sadly, the whole thing is
this is the thing I was really trying to get at, is that how these have now become paranormal lore. They've entered folklore. These tragic, historically battle-driven events that were badly organized in every kind of way, but how we sort of remember them through the paranormal lens. And that's how this particular case should, in many ways, be forgotten, because it was a tragic loss of people. And it's sort of forgotten to history. It's not forgotten because it's this folklore that grips it under this story of heroism. Did they get saved by angels? Did they get saved by aliens? No. A terrible thing happened. But that's how we've kind of subconsciously, through the tapestry of history, are recalling these events. Because that's the only reason we're talking about it today, is through, I listened to that podcast, and there was 800 men who disappeared through a portal, and I'm like, where'd that come from?
The 800 is because it's roughly the full strength of a British battalion at that time on operations. If they'd all been deployed, I suppose, somewhere between 600 and 1,000, depending on how many actually could be brought to bear. Most battalions throughout history have been under strength, so I'm guessing that 800 is just meant to be the strength of the 1/5. The first regiment, 5th Battalion, Norfolks. But the problem with this, as always, is that it's sad that the story of real heroism and real bravery and real death on both sides has been obscured by what is just a ridiculous myth. What is worth reading is Dick's book on the Norfolks at Gallipoli, which is easy to find in Norfolk and hard to find anywhere else. And Steve Smith's brilliant. He wrote 5 fantastic blog posts. And the History UK article is actually a summary of those. But the 5 blog posts are really good. The History UK one's got, as I said, a couple of minor issues I'd take with it. But definitely the blog posts are the definitive stuff on the battle if you can't get Dick's book. Anyway, thanks very much, Kristian. It's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. I'm going to shut up now and let other people talk. And sorry to have gone on so much, but as you probably gathered, this is something I know about.
It's good to have a knowledge perspective individual, which is kind of what I was calling about, that no one in that particular lady's book, had done the due diligence and actually asked the question, or just looked at a source material that might say, hey, wait a minute, this is not that case at all.
But as a paranormal researcher, I came across the debunking of this, as I said, back in the late 70s, early 80s. Melvin Harris, Frank Smythe, Peter Brooksmith's The Unexplained was an every W.H. Smith in the country. So the fact that the myth has managed, Peter Haining told the story in one of his books for children, and he was notoriously inaccurate at times. He was a nice guy, but I met him once, but he was, or I didn't actually meet him. I spoke to him on the phone, and he sent me a check because he felt sorry for me, I think. But he was an East Anglian journalist, and he wrote an account of it, and his version is exactly the one that based on the New Zealanders' account. But the paranormal version is a lot sexier, isn't it?
It is.
They died of heat stroke, exhaustion, salt depletion, or being shot. The 1999 story, of course, adds the thing that it ends with them the prisoners of war being massacred in an atrocity by the Turks, which actually never happened. And that's still controversial. It still upsets Frank Speck's relatives to this very day that they made a drama in which it ends with them all putting their hands up and being shot when that never happened. We know that because when they did the War Graves Commission reports, it actually rules out that kind of thing. Anyway, I better go and shut.
CJ, before you disappear, sorry, Kristian, before you disappear, you're providing if things go well, you're providing our webinar next week, aren't you?
Yeah, Kristian can come along and heckle me then. Yeah, that seems fair. So, all right. Take care, everyone. Kristian was brilliant. Thank you very much. Sorry if I witted too much, but it is a topic very dear to my heart and obviously to my grandmother's as well. Take care. Bye.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, CJ. And Kristian, I will find out what he's going to be speaking on, and I'll give you the tip, and you can read up on it and research it and everything, and give him a taste of his own medicine. No, it's lovely to hear people with such a passion for a topic being able to discuss it, and thank you for your input too, Kieran, and I hope you're feeling better. Yes, if anybody else